I run real Singapore proxy infrastructure and cloud phone farms for a living, and I manage account fleets that go well past the size where you can hold everything in your head. I've had teammates, I've had operations I needed to step away from, and I've watched what happens when the documentation doesn't exist and something goes wrong on a day nobody's watching the dashboard. It's the exact framework I use to keep proxies, devices, browser profiles, and warm-up state matched to the right accounts when I'm not the only person touching the fleet. So here's a test I run on my own setup every few months, and I'd suggest you run it on yours too. Pick 5 accounts at random and try to answer from written records alone, not memory. Which proxy each one uses, which device or profile it's bound to, and what stage of warm-up it's currently in. If you can't answer that in under a minute per account, without opening 10 different apps and piecing it together, you don't have a documented fleet. You have an operation that only exists properly inside your own head. And that's a real liability. None of this matters much when you're running 5 or 10 accounts by yourself, and nothing's ever gone sideways. Your memory genuinely is the documentation at that scale. It stops being fine the moment you get sick for a week, or you hire someone to help manage the load, or a client wants you to hand off an account, or you just want a weekend off without a platform ban sitting there unnoticed for 4 days because nobody happened to check. Account fleet documentation isn't busy work you do to look organized. It's what turns a fleet into an actual system, instead of one person doing a lot of manual labor. A fleet isn't just a spreadsheet of usernames and passwords, and if that's all you've got, you're missing most of what actually matters. Every account in a serious setup carries a stack of dependencies that all have to stay matched to each other. There's a browser profile with its own fingerprint. There is a proxy assigned to that profile, and only that profile. There is a device or cloud phone if you're running anything mobile native, and there's a warm-up history that determines what the account is allowed to do today versus what it'll be allowed to do a month from now. If any one of those pieces gets separated from the account and then reattached wrong, you're not just risking an outright ban. You're risking something quieter, a flag that throttles the account without telling you anything, so you keep operating it thinking it's perfectly healthy while its actual performance has already dropped. That's the scenario documentation is meant to prevent, not the dramatic one where an account gets suspended and you notice immediately, but the slow one where nothing looks wrong on the surface and you don't find out until you're looking at 3 weeks of underperformance you can't explain. So for every single account, at minimum, the record needs to answer a handful of questions. Which browser profile and fingerprint configuration is this account bound to? And has that exact fingerprint ever been reused on another account? Which proxy, specifically, is assigned to it? Not just a generic label like a Singapore residential proxy, but the actual IP or session ID, and whether that's a static assignment or something rotating. If it's on a cloud phone or a physical device, which one and what else is running on that same device, what stage of warm-up the account is in, and what it's currently allowed to do, and any warning, verification prompt, or restriction it's already hit. None of that is exotic. It's the kind of record-keeping any operations team in any industry would recognize immediately. The reason account operators skip it is simple. In the early stage, with 5 or 10 accounts, you genuinely don't need it, your memory covers it fine. The problem is that this stops scaling around account 15 or 20, and by the time people notice it stopped working, they've already built months of bad habits around never writing anything down, which makes starting the discipline later feel like way more work than it actually is. Now, of everything on that list, the proxy to account pairing is the piece people cut corners on most often, and it's the one that costs the most when it breaks. Every account should be bound to one proxy, consistently, for its entire lifecycle. That's not a tidiness preference. It's actually how residential and mobile proxies function to prevent correlation in the first place. A platform's detection systems are building a picture of an account over time. The IP ranges it logs in from, the ASE, whether its geography stays consistent, how its sessions behave session to session. If 2 of your accounts share an exit IP, or if one account is bouncing between IP addresses that don't share a consistent carrier or region history, that's a signal. I want to be precise here. It's not an automatic ban. Detection systems weigh a lot of signals together, and this is just one data point among many. But it's a data point that works against you, and it's one that costs you nothing to avoid if you simply keep the pairing consistent and write down what that pairing actually is instead of trusting your memory. Mobile proxies add a wrinkle that's worth documenting on its own line, not folding into the general rule. Carrier-grade NAT means a lot of real mobile users legitimately share the same IP address at the same time. That's just how mobile carrier networks are built. So mobile proxy reuse doesn't carry anywhere near the same weight as data center or even residential IP reuse would. But your documentation still needs to record whether a given proxy is a dedicated session just for you or a shared pool, because that fact changes how you should reason about it if an account starts behaving oddly. If this pairing only lives in your head, or worse, it gets reassigned casually because the old proxy felt slow that day, you've broken a chain that might have taken weeks to build, and you can't undo that. Write the pairing down as a fact, not a preference you might revisit on a whim. And when you do need to change it, treat that change with the same seriousness you'd use moving physical keys between two locked accounts, because functionally that's exactly what you're doing. Warm-up state is the next piece, and it's harder to document well because it's not a fixed fact, it's a moving target. Warm-up isn't a switch you flip once and forget. It's a gradient. An account that's 2 days old should not be attempting anywhere near the same volume or type of activity as one that's been active and behaviorally normal for 6 weeks. If a teammate picks up an account and has no idea where it sits on that gradient, there are really only two mistakes available to them, and they're both bad. Either they push the account too hard, too soon, because they don't know it's still fragile, or they leave it sitting idle for too long because they're cautious and unsure, and the warm-up investment you already put into it starts going stale. Both outcomes waste the work that went into building that account up in the first place, and neither mistake happens because the teammate is careless. It happens because the information genuinely wasn't available to them when they needed it. The fix here is boring, which is exactly why it works. Log the start date. Log every stage transition as it happens. Log the date of the last meaningful activity on the account. A single line that says something like warm up started early June, stage 2 reached about 2 weeks later, last active 2 days ago, tells a teammate everything they need to make a good judgment call without asking you a single question. Without that line, they're guessing, and guessing is precisely what produces the inconsistent behavior patterns detection systems are built to notice. Fingerprint nodes are the last technical piece, and they matter more than people give them credit for. Anti-detect browsers work by presenting a consistent, plausible device and browser fingerprint for each profile: canvas signature, WebGL output, font list, time zones, screen resolution, dozens of smaller signals, all held stable across sessions for that one account. The documentation gap here is almost always about reuse. If two profiles got cloned from the same template and nobody tracked that fact, you now have two accounts that look suspiciously identical to each other on dimensions that shouldn't be identical at all. So note which profile template every single account was built from, and treat never reusing a fingerprint across accounts that need to look unrelated as a rule you actually write down somewhere, not a rule you trust yourself to remember 6 months from now when you've built 200 more profiles since. I say this from experience. Memory is genuinely unreliable at that scale, and the accounts that get correlated because of a reused template are almost never the ones you'd have guessed. So what does the actual document look like in practice? The best version of this, in my experience, is one row per account in a shared access control sheet or a lightweight internal tool, not a wiki page full of pros that nobody keeps current because updating pros feels like a chore. Columns for platform, account identifier, browser profile ID, assigned proxy, device if applicable, warm-up stage, last activity date, and a free text notes field for anything unusual, a verification prompt that came up, a support ticket that's still open, a restriction that's temporary and due to lift. The key habit is updating that sheet as part of the actual workflow, right when you touch an account, not as a separate chore you sit down and do at the end of the week from memory. The end of the week from memory version will always be wrong because you'll forget the small stuff. The one-time verification prompt you dismissed without thinking twice, the proxy you swapped because the old session dropped. Small stuff is exactly what a teammate needs most. Free tembus ender mfams instructions document, separate from the per account data, what to do if an account gets a verification prompt, who to notify if something looks flagged, what the escalation path is if a proxy drops mid-session. That document is what actually lets someone else take over tomorrow. Not just look at a list of your accounts and their current stats, but genuinely know what to do with them when something unexpected happens, which, running a fleet long enough, it eventually will. None of this is compliance theater for its own sake. It's about making your fleet legible to a second person, So the whole operation isn't a single point of failure sitting quietly in your browser history and your own memory. An operation you can hand off, even temporarily, for a week or a weekend, is an operation you actually understand yourself, because the act of writing it down forces you to notice the parts you've been running on autopilot without even realizing it. That's worth more than the hour or two it takes to set up. I run these forms myself, so when I point you at the proxies or cloud phones I actually use, you're seeing the real stack, not an affiliate guess. Full written guides and tested picks are up at multiaccountops.com. Go check them out, and if this kind of operational detail is useful to you, subscribe for more.